Hello everyone, welcome to our third lecture for week one, the context of the organization. In this lecture we're going to begin to get into the 14001 requirements and explain a little bit about what they mean and some of the systems theory underlying how the standard was developed. As we can see, we go back to our diagram for the clauses of the standard. This week we're going to talk about the context of the organization, Clause 4. Going to discuss a little bit about internal and external issues, the needs and expectations of interested parties, as well as the scope of the environmental management system. So these are the areas we're concentrating on this week. And as I said before, we're going to work our way through this model as we go through the class, and we're going to cover all the requirements of the standard so you can see how it fits into both the high-level structure and the Plan, Do, Check, Act format, as well as the process approach. In order to understand why the context of the organization is important, it's important to understand the systems approach to managing organizations. And in the systems approach, an organization is viewed as a set of interrelating elements that have separate functions that add up to an overall purpose and interact with each other in ways that exemplify a set of predefined relationships to maintain the structure of the system. In systems theory, well, this is not really going to be a class on systems theory, but I'll give you some basics so you can understand why context is so important. In systems theory, there are two types of systems: closed systems and open systems. In a closed system, all elements of the system are closed off from the external environment. It's an isolated system that has no interaction with this external environment. Nothing is lost or added. In an open system, however, the system itself adapts and changes by interacting with this external environment to offset the effects of entropy, which are eventual degradation. The open systems take inputs from the environment, transform them, and send them back to the environment as output or waste, and adjust processes to achieve the system goals, to maintain itself as a viable entity. For those of you who know about biosphere, biosphere was an experiment in human living that was essentially a closed system. They attempted to close off a structure to see if humans could survive within a closed system that was powered just by solar energy. It ultimately failed. Some of the soils, I believe, became too acidic. The greenhouse did not provide enough calories or enough nutrition for people to survive. And so as an experiment in a closed system where the travelers went in and they closed the door behind them and they were to stay in there, I believe, for about a year, it didn't work. It simply didn't work. But most ecosystems that we are familiar with are open systems. They exchange energy and air, and they have nutrient recycling within them, and both to the external environment and within the ecosystem itself. And so this is a very important distinction. From an organizational standpoint, many managers behave as if their organization is closed. It's isolated. What happens here doesn't affect anywhere else. But the management gurus at ISO recognize that all organizations are open systems. They do interact with their external environment in many different ways. And in fact, the most effective organizations actively solicit information and actively manage those relationships with their external environment in order to prevent entropy. We see that organizations that tend to be closed off and isolated tend to disintegrate over time, whereas those that are more open and more interchanging with their external environment revise their processes, adapt, and change. When we start applying systems theory to organizations and to management systems, we see that there are three areas of relevance for understanding how an organization interacts with its environment. From the management system perspective, we have the primary area of control. This is the scope of the management system. This is the area in which executive managers or leaders can specify what resources are required, align those resources, and make sure that the organization's mission is being accomplished through the enactment of the processes. The next area that's important is what we call the transactional environment. This is where the organization influences its external environment by providing value to various stakeholders, customers, suppliers, that kind of a thing. This is where managers seek to influence what's going on around them and learn and adapt to the direct influence of the players in this area. The third area is the independent environment. This is an area of understanding. But the management system recognizes that the changes going on in the independent environment are important, and so that the managers should recognize and adapt their systems to these changes to make sure that the organization remains a viable entity. The key here, and why this diagram is important, is because the management system scope is the area of control. The area of influence is the area of what we call interested parties, and the area of understanding is just the general environment of the world. And so these three areas are very relevant to establishing conformance to the first set of requirements, which is the organizational context for a 14001 based EMS. There are a couple of definitions that are important. We see that ISO defines a management system as a set of interrelated or interacting elements of an organization to establish policies and objectives and processes to achieve those objectives. An environmental management system is, interestingly enough, a part of the management system that's used to manage environmental aspects, fulfill compliance obligations, and address risks and opportunities. The third part here is documented information. We're going to see this again and again throughout the standard. Documented information is information required to be controlled and maintained by an organization and the medium on which it is contained. So it's the paper as well as the information on it. Documented information can be in any format, any media, from any source, videos, recordings, things like this. And documented information can refer to the environmental management system, which we'll see in a minute. Well, actually, in our next lecture, we're going to see how the environmental management system is documented. Information created in order for the organization to operate. This is also known as documentation. And evidence of results achieved. These can be referred to as records. So within the organization, its context, as we saw before, consists of an area of influence and an area of understanding. And so the context that the managers are learning about, first of all, is the environmental conditions that are related to climate, air quality, water quality, land use, existing contamination, natural resource availability, biodiversity, that can either affect the organization's purpose or be affected by its environmental aspects. Second of all, the context is also the external cultural, social, political, legal, regulatory, financial, technological, economic, natural, and competitive circumstances. And these can be local, they can be regional, national, or international. And finally, we see that the context is also the internal characteristics or conditions of the organization: activities, products and services, strategic direction, culture and capability, people, knowledge, processes, and systems. So from our diagram before, we see that the internal characteristics are the area of control, And both the environmental conditions and the external circumstances are both areas of influence and areas of understanding. So now we come to the actual requirements of the standard for understanding the organization and its context. Throughout the standard, there are what we call shall statements. And shall statements are requirements. This means that wherever you see a shall, the managers have to do something. So the first shall statement is that the organization shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its environmental management system. We saw some of those issues before in a previous slide. And such issues shall include environmental conditions being affected by or capable of affecting the organization. We saw some in the guidance examples of some criteria for issues that should be included. And we go back to our management systems diagram, and we see that these issues come from two areas: the independent environment and the transactional environment, the area of influence and the area of understanding. This is why we have these arrows here, which show interactions between the management system, the organization itself, and the area of influence and the area of understanding. We have a heavy line here to show that the scope of the management system is well defined. In clause 4.2, the standards require that managers understand the needs and expectations of interested parties. Again, we have a shall statement. The organization shall determine, first of all, who are these interested parties? Interested parties that are relevant to the environmental management system, the relevant needs and expectations of these interested parties, and this is a new requirement for the 2015. Which of these needs and expectations become its compliance obligations? Interested parties could be professional organizations like those that offer certifications for auto mechanics. Hint, hint for your possible final project. So the standard requires a high level of interaction with these interested parties, identifying them, understanding their needs and expectations, and then deciding which of these needs and expectations become compliance obligations for the organization. What are we going to do with these? Are we going to ignore interested parties, or we're going to comply with their needs and expectations? Finally, what we have to do within an EMS is to determine its scope. The scope is two things: the boundaries and applicability of the environmental management system. So in order to do this, you look at what are the key external and internal issues that affect the organization. What are the compliance obligations? What are the organizational units, functions, and physical boundaries? This is generally where the scope is set within the physical boundaries of an operating unit. The activities, products, and services of an organization, although you could delimit the scope if you wanted to a particular set of activities. And finally, the scope needs to be set so that within the scope, leadership can exercise control and influence over the elements of the EMS and has the authority and the ability to do so. And once your scope is defined, all of the activities, products, and services of the organization within that scope must be included in the environmental management system. And we come to the third third element here, which is documented information. So the organization has to document the scope of its EMS. So anytime you see a shall statement, shall be maintained as documented information, that means we've basically got to document the actual decision that we've made here based on the criteria that are reflected in the standard. Fourth, once we've looked at interested parties, once we've determined our scope and we've determined the operating context of the environmental management system, we have to actually establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve an environmental management system. So these are the four things. We have to develop it. We have to implement it, make it happen. We've got to work on it over time. In other words, pay attention to it. And then we have to continually improve it. So these are the, again, plan, do, check, and then act system reflected in a subclause of environmental management, and also reflected in the overall structure as well as the 4.4 clause for establishing an EMS. And then we have to consider the knowledge gained in 4.1 interested parties and issues when establishing and maintaining it. And then, so you have to be able to demonstrate how you're meeting this. This is another part of the standard, is that anytime there is a shall statement, if you intend to be certified to the standard, you have to be able to demonstrate how you are meeting that requirement, how you're conforming to the requirement. So anytime you see a shall statement within an organization, managers can ask themselves, how have we established an EMS? How have we implemented it? How are we maintaining it? And how are we continually improving it? And then how have we considered the knowledge gained in 4.1 and 4.2? How are we doing this? How are we including the views of interested parties and key issues? So how are we doing this? So that's it for this week's content lecture. We'll see you in the discussion threads. If you have any questions, just ask them in the instructor office threads.